After 12 years building my father's company to $75 million, he gave it to my brother. Did they really think I'd just accept that? After 12 years of operating my father's company, I finally increased its value to $75 million. At a family supper, my father glanced at me and smiled. "Your brother, Kevin, will take over now." My heart dropped, but I smiled back. The following morning at work, everything changed. I vividly remember my father's smile that, his hand resting proudly on Kevin's shoulder, as if he had already made up his mind before saying the words that would change everything. "Your brother, Kevin, will take over now." I felt my stomach plummet, but years of skill kept my expression calm. I smiled back, as if his words hadn't pierced right through me, unraveling 12 years of my life's work. The dining room was alive with the clinking of glasses and the gentle hum of talks among extended relatives and close business associates. This was more than just a family dinner. It was a celebration, a minute to honor everything we had built, everything I built. My father founded Parker & Company when I was a child, a small logistics company that struggled to stay alive during its early years. I grew up watching my father fight to keep things going, working late hours, forgoing family holidays, and always pursuing the next contract to make ends. When I was 24, fresh out of business school, he eventually let me in, though I had to fight for the opportunity. I had done more than simply step in. Parker & Company had grown from a struggling regional logistics concern to a nationwide powerhouse under my leadership, with operations expanded, million-dollar contracts secured, and cutting-edge technology in it. What was once a small, virtually bankrupt company has grown into an industry leader valued at $75 million. But at this moment, none of it mattered. My father had already made the decision. My brother, Kevin, would take over, not me. A gentle wave of approval rippled over the table, with murmurs of congratulations directed toward Kevin. I watched as he lowered his gaze, pretending modesty, though I knew better. Kevin had never completely invested in the firm. He'd spent the last decade jumping from one failed business to the next, never quite finding his feet. He was not interested in logistics. He was not interested in operations. However, he was interested in power. I'd spent 12 years proving myself, starting Parker & Company from the bottom up, making every difficult decision, late-night strategy call, and contract negotiation. Kevin hadn't done any of it, and yet here we were nonetheless. I swallowed my emotions. I learned a long time ago that exhibiting pain was considered a weakness in this household. I reached for my wine glass and steadied my hand before lifting it. "Kevin," I smiled. "Smile," I replied, my voice smooth and controlled. The visitors raised their glasses, unaware of the tempest developing behind my eyes. My mother looked at me from across the table, an unreadable expression on her face, but I knew she understood. Unlike my father, Mom had always recognized the effort I put in, but she refused to interfere. She never did. Then there was my father, smiling with the same unflinching assurance, fully oblivious that his decision had put something in motion. Kevin met my eyes from across the table, a smirk barely visible on the corner of his lips. That was the moment I knew this was not solely my father's decision. Kevin had waited for this. He had carefully positioned himself, portraying the loyal son who had finally discovered his purpose. My father, a staunch conservative, saw no problem in his rationale. The kingdom should be passed down from father to son. A daughter? A daughter's efforts were always viewed as temporary, a footnote in history, no matter how hard she worked to show difference. But what they didn't realize, and none of them had considered, was that I had spent the previous 12 years not only developing a company, but also consolidating my position inside it. And the next morning, they'd figure out what that meant. That night, I hardly slept. My thoughts replayed every second, sacrifice I'd made for Parker & Company, late nights, missed birthdays, and relationships strained under the weight of my desire. I had given everything to this company, and now they expect me to just step aside? No, they'd underestimated me. By 3 a.m., I was in my home office, typing furiously on my keyboard, each contract, every share, all executive agreement. Nobody knew how this company worked better than I did. Kevin expected a smooth transition, that by next week his name would be on the office door and his employment would be guaranteed. What he didn't realize was that while my father was busy making public appearances and my brother was busy pretending to understand the business, I had secured something much more valuable: control. I entered Parker and Company headquarters at exactly 8:45 a.m., as I had done for the previous 12 years. The same walls, the same polished floors, the same hum of efficiency persisted as staff settled into their routines. But today was different. Today, I didn't walk into my office. I was walking into a battleground. The reception area was unusually quiet, the type of silence that comes before a storm. They knew. The whispers had already begun. The story of my father's declaration during dinner had circulated quickly. Employees looked at me with uncomfortable looks, avoiding direct eye contact, unsure where their loyalty should rest. I did not acknowledge them. I strolled confidently, my heels tapping on the marble flooring, my stance solid. Never show them you were disturbed. I entered my office, shutting the door behind me. I had exactly 15 minutes until my father and Kevin arrived, expecting to take over as CEO and a parent respectively, 15 minutes before their entire strategy disintegrated in front of them. I sat at my desk, inhaled deeply, and then turned on my computer. The screen displayed a list of sensitive documents and contracts that they had never considered looking at and assumed did not matter. I opened my ownership records, lingering my hands over the keyboard for a moment before clicking on the file labeled Executive Shareholder Agreement, and then I waited. A strong knock on my door came at precisely 9 a.m. I did not bother answering. The door opened, and my father and Kevin strolled in, both exuding confidence, his inborn, Kevin's carefully crafted. My father walked in like a monarch surveying his realm, and Kevin, dressed in an expensive navy suit, flashed me a smug, triumphant grin. It took everything I had not to laugh. "Lisa," my father said in his custom, forceful tone, as if acknowledging me as a favor. "I assume you're aware of the transition happening today." Transition? Interesting wording. "I'm aware," I replied easily, reclining back in my chair. I looked at Kevin, whose smirk became wider. "Good," my father said, nodding as if we all agreed. "Kevin will be stepping in as the new CEO. We need you to help with the handover. Get him familiar with the operations before you officially move on." I raised an eyebrow. "Move on," I repeated, faking ignorance. "Dad, I think you're mistaken about something." His face twitched with annoyance. He was used to my silent cooperation and ability to follow instructions. He was unprepared for this. "Lisa," he murmured, his voice tight, as if addressing a child, "this isn't up for debate. We've already made the decision." I smiled a slow, knowing smile. "Oh, I know, Dad," I answered softly. "The thing is, you don't have the authority to make that decision." Kevin Skodovs quietly and shakes his head. "Lisa, don't make this difficult. We're trying to do this the easy way." I did not respond. Instead, I went for my remote and clicked a button. The enormous screen on my office wall displayed a document that I had been examining earlier, Executive Shareholders Agreement, signed on August 17, 2015, signatories, Lisa Parker, James Parker, and Kevin Parker. My father's face paled somewhat. I turned to Kevin. "Do you even know what this document is?" He crossed his arms and shifted in discomfort. "A shareholders agreement," he wondered. I nodded. "Yes." "And do you know what it says?" I tapped the screen to highlight an important clause. This document was drafted when Parker and Company was restructuring. It clearly states that any transfer of executive power, such as appointing a new CEO, requires the approval of all majority shareholders. I caught my father's gaze. "And I, Dad, hold 60% of the company's shares." The silence that followed was smothering. My father's expression darkened. "That's impossible," Kevin whispered as he moved forward to examine the page. "Actually, it's very possible," I replied calmly. "You see, over the years, while you were busy failing at every startup you touched and Dad was busy playing the role of business patriarch, I was doing something else." I leaned forwards. I was securing my place. I turned back to face my father. "Remember when you needed capital for expansion in 2017? You agreed to give me an additional 15% of your shares in exchange for my investment. And in 2019, when we had that court dispute, another 10% was transferred under my name as collateral, which you never bothered to record. That, plus my original 35%, gives me the controlling stake." My dad's jaw clenched, but Kevin was in a panic. "You have to be bluffing," he exclaimed. I took out a second document. "This is the most recent legal filing with the state. Want to verify?" Kevin took the paper and scanned it, his face losing color with every passing second. "You can't do it," he muttered. "Dad, tell her she can't do this." My father stayed silent because he knew I had lawfully outmaneuvered him and he couldn't do anything about it. I sighed softly and stood up. I'm not firing you, Kevin, I explained. I don't want to force you into the real job market, but you will report to me and work under my guidance. Otherwise, I motioned to the door. You're free to leave. Kevin looked at my father, his eyes begging, but for the first time in his life, my father had no response. There was no way to fix it because it wasn't his company anymore. That was mine. The silence in my workplace felt oppressive. Kevin still held the official document in his hand, his fingers white from holding it too firmly. My father remained motionless beside him, his expression unreadable, but I knew better. He was calculating, trying to figure a way out of this. There was not one. I had spent years preparing for this, not because I expected treachery, but because experience had taught me never to presume loyalty in situations of authority. For the first time in my life, my father didn't recognize. Maybe he never had. Is that it? Kevin eventually spoke, his voice tinged with resentment. Are you just taking everything? I laughed softly, without humor. Am I taking everything? I repeated, moving closer to him. Kevin, I created this company from nothing. I made every contract, expansion, and innovation a reality while you were busy failing. I was keeping this company running. So no, I'm not taking anything. I leaned in slightly. I'm just keeping what's already mine. Kevin's face contorted in rage, but he had no response. He knew I was correct, and worse, so did my father. He had spent years believing that bloodline was more important than skill, that his son would receive what was properly mine. He'd underestimated me, and now he had to pay for his folly. My father eventually ended the hunt. You're making a mistake, Lisa. His voice was calm and calculated, but I could sense the pressure underlying. Families should stick together. Do you truly want to end this relationship? I met his eyes unflinchingly. Dad, I said, you burned this bridge the moment you made your decision without me. His lips formed a thin line. Business is larger than one person. We could develop a solution that benefits everyone. I cocked my head slightly, simulating interest. Oh, I agree. I let the words hang in the air before proceeding. That's why I'm offering you both a choice. I wanted Kevin first. You can stay with the company, I added, keeping my voice smooth and professional, but you will not be CEO. You will serve as an advisor with limited authority. Your compensation will be generous, but you will report to me. Kevin stiffened, but I did not stop. Or, I added, you can walk away. I will acquire your shares at market value. You can take the money and start working on a new project. My dad scoffed. You're acting like you hold all the cards. I smiled. I do. My words were followed by a dead hush. I let them sit in it, let them experience what it was like to be powerless. Finally, my father breathed, shaking his head in astonishment. I never thought you'd do this, he grumbled. Not to your own family. At his comments, I felt a searing pain. Not to your own family? I wanted to tell him he was the one who did it, that he chose to cast me aside as if I were only temporary, but I did not. In the end, it didn't matter. What was important was that I would not let them remove what I had built. Not now, not ever. Kevin was the first to storm out. Good riddance. I knew my brother well enough to anticipate his next action. He would approach our relatives and family acquaintances, presenting himself as a victim of corporate deception. I didn't care. I was not here to win their approval. I came here to win my future. My father waited for a while longer, as if expecting me to alter my mind. When I didn't respond, he nodded slowly. You've changed, he stated gently. I met his gaze. No, Dad. I just finally stopped pretending. Then he departed. I breathed and returned to my chair. I should have felt victorious. I had fought for my position and won. But as I glanced at the vacant doorway, I sensed something else, a soft, lingering ache. A part of me had always wished for my father's approval. Some small, desperate part of me believed that if I worked hard enough, prove myself repeatedly, he would eventually see me, but he never truly looked. So now he had no choice but to see me for who I truly was. Not his daughter, not his temporary replacement, the genuine boss of Parker & Company. I returned to my computer, my attention changing. I had spent 12 years creating this business. Now I'd spend the next 12 years making it untouchable. My father and brother attempted to take everything from me, but in the end, they were the ones who had lost everything. For the first time in 12 years, my workplace felt empty. There were no phone calls from my father. Kevin sent no passive-aggressive emails, just silence. But silence did not indicate serenity. It meant the struggle had started. I knew my father wouldn't leave peacefully, and Kevin, he would fight tooth and nail to restore what he believed was his birthright. I wasn't naive enough to believe this was over. It had just begun. By the next morning, I could detect an undercurrent of discomfort in the company. Employees who had greeted me with confidence last week now appeared nervous, as if they were terrified to choose a side. Several department heads avoided eye contact. I knew exactly what was going on. My father and Kevin were using the Whisper Network, old family pals, board members, senior executives. They were spreading doubts, painting myself as frigid, ruthless, disloyal. Kevin, in particular, had taken on the character of the wounded son betrayed by his sister. I could see him now, seated in a high-end restaurant, pretending to be sorry as he told our investors how I had taken the firm from him. And what about my father? He would not need to say much at all, just a deep sigh, a shaky head, the neatly arranged words, "I only ever wanted the best for my children." It was calculated and risky, because if they could turn my board members and senior executives against, they may force me out of my own company. At the very least, make my leadership impossible. I wasn't going to let that happen. That afternoon, I scheduled an emergency executive meeting. As I entered the boardroom, I could feel the tension in the air. Half of the room averted my gaze. The other half observed me too closely, waiting for me to slip. I took a seat at the head of the table, my seat. "Let's not waste time," I added, my tone steady. I know there have been conversations behind closed doors, over drinks and hushed voices. I let my gaze sweep the room, pausing on each individual just long enough to cause them to squirm, uncomfortable. I'm also aware that some of you are asking if my leadership is sustainable. Several folks tensed. Nobody spoke. I tapped my fingers on the polished wooden table. Let's clear that up now. I displayed a presentation on the screen behind me. Numbers, data, facts. I transformed this company from a struggling regional business to a $75 million industry leader. Under my leadership, we've increased sales by 300% over the last 5 years and entered 6 new markets. I turned to the CFO, Paul. Do we have a single financial indicator suggesting this company is in trouble under my leadership? Paul hesitated before shaking his head. No. In fact, projections show another 20% growth in the next quarter. I nodded. So let's be honest about what's happening here. I leaned forwards. My father and brother are not unhappy because the business is faltering. They're not upset because I'm failing to lead. They are furious because they expected me to step aside and let Kevin take over regardless of qualification, regardless of the outcome. The room was silent. Then I dropped the true bombshell. I also know that some of you have been contacted in the last 24 hours, offered incentives to push for my resignation. I tilted my head slightly. If anyone here would like to disclose those conversations, this is your chance. Several folks shuffled on uncomfortably. Then, after a lengthy period, one of the senior executives cleared his throat. "I received a call," he said, "from your father. He said he was considering making an official appeal to the board." I nodded, not surprised. "And did he offer anything in return for your support?" A pause, then a slow nod. "There it is." I breathed and stood up. "My father built this company," I replied. "I will not dispute that, but I went further than he could have, and I will not let him manage it from the outside." I let my voice drop slightly, controlled and threatening. "If you want to fight, he'll get one." I gathered my papers and looked each executive in the eyes. "If anyone here believes my father and brother deserve control, now is the time to make your move." Silence. Nobody moved. Good. I turned and went away, head held high. It wasn't just about keeping my company. This was to ensure that they never imagined they could take it from me. That night, I made my own call, not to any board member, not for an investor, but what about the media? By morning, the business section of every major news outlet featured the following headline: "Power shift at Parker & Company. Lisa Parker outmaneuvers family in boardroom battle." I made my move. Now it was their turn, and I waited. My inbox burst the morning after my story went to publication, emails, missed calls, messages from reporters, investors, and board members. Some were supportive, some were cautious. However, most of them had one question in common: is it true? I let them wait. I knew what game my father was playing. He had spent decades mastering the art of public perception. He understood that reputation was important in business. If he couldn't beat me in the boardroom, he would undercut me in public, and that was exactly what he was attempting to do. By lunchtime, the first counterattack had arrived, a press release, nicely made, precisely phrased, but full of lies. Parker and Company has always been a family-owned business. We are disappointed by recent occurrences, but we remain dedicated to sustaining the ideals that have driven this organization. Changes in leadership are unavoidable, and we expect to transition seamlessly as we move forward. It was subtle, but I knew what was actually saying. Lisa is irresponsible. Lisa is unstable. Lisa isn't a team player. I was not surprised. I was, however, incensed. I sat in my office watching the news as industry analysts argued over my leadership. Was Lisa Parker too aggressive in her takeover? Will her lack of cooperation hurt the company in the long run? Can she recover from this PR disaster? They spoke as if I wasn't watching, as if I hadn't already planned my next move, because if my father and Kevin desired a public conflict, I was planning to give them one. I did not release a statement. I did not call a press conference. Instead, I placed one phone call to an old buddy in investigative journal. I have something for you, I explained, but you'll need to move fast. An hour later, I emailed over documents, emails, financial reporting, internal record, evidence. Harper and Company, under my father's guidance, had engaged in unethical business activities. Throughout time, I had spent the previous decade quietly cleaning up. The news broke within 24 hours. Behind the scenes at Parker and Company, a legacy of hidden debts and financial cover-ups. The piece was brutal. It applauded my leadership for improving the company's financial situation. It was critical of my father's mismanagement, but most importantly, it proved that I was the sole reason Parker and Company had survived. Just like that, the narrative changed. The board has stopped doubting me. The investors stopped hesitating. And what about my father? He had nowhere to hide. 2 days later, my father finally contacted me. I let the phone ring 3 times before answering. "Lisa," he murmured in a tense voice, "we need to talk." I slumped back in my chair. "Do we?" Silence. Finally, a sigh. "You didn't have to do that." I gave a tiny laugh. "Neither did you. This company was supposed to be a legacy," he told me. "For the family, for both of you." I had a familiar pain. A small, naive part of me had once desired that, but not anymore. "Dad," I spoke gently, "if you wanted me to safeguard the legacy, you should have trusted me with it. Instead, you attempted to steal it from me." Another prolonged stillness. He asked, almost reluctantly, "What happens now?" I breathed slowly. Now I'm going to make sure you never touch my company again." The conflict was over. My father had lost. Kevin had vanished, and I'd won. However, when I sat in my office, staring out at the metropolitan skyline, I felt no happiness, no victory, just emptiness. I had spent the last 12 years fighting for Parker and Company, building it, safeguarding it, and making it stronger than ever. Nonetheless, the cost of that win outweighed my expectations because I had secured my position. I had misplaced something else along the road, my fame. The next day, I came into the office as if nothing had happened, but everybody knew the truth. The whispers had ended. The doubt had dissipated. I was no longer simply Lisa Parker, CEO. I was Lisa Parker, the lady who outmaneuvered her father and brother and emerged victorious. Some people appreciated me for it. Some scared me because of it, and some were still waiting for me to fall. I let them wait. At midday, my father and I convened in the conference room for our final conversation. He seemed exhausted, older, as if the weight of what had happened had finally fallen on his shoulders. I waited for him to speak first. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than I'd ever heard it. "I'm retiring," he announced simply, effective immediately. I did not react. I had anticipated this. "I'll sell my remaining shares," he added. "I'll keep a small percentage as an investor, but I won't be involved anymore." I examined him attentively. "And Kevin?" His jaw stiffened. "He's gone," my father admits, "took the buyout. He won't be back." A part of me knew it would end like this. Kevin had never been strong enough to face his own difficulties. When he realized he had lost, he did what he always did, run still. Hearing it out made something inside me ache. No regret, not guilty, simply the finality of it. I nodded, understood. My father exhaled and rubbed his temples as if he had a headache. Then, after a long gap, he said something unexpected. "I underestimated you." It was not an apology, but it was as close as I'd ever come, and strangely, I realized I didn't need it anymore. A month later, Parker and Company looked nothing like it did previously. Who were the previous board members who supported my father and Kevin? Gone. What about the executives who had questioned my leadership? Replaced. The company had always performed well under my leadership, but now it was absolutely mine, and with that control comes a new perspective. I introduced proposals that my father had consistently rejected. He has described modernized systems as unnecessary. He ventured into industries that he had previously avoided. Within 6 months, profits skyrocketed. Within a year, we had reached the $100 million mile. For the first time in my life, I wasn't battling solely to prove myself. I was fighting to create something that no one could take from me again. A year later, I met my father for dinner. It was the first time we had talked since his retirement. He looked different, quieter. He wasn't angry now, simply accepting. I read about the latest deal you closed. He continued as he drank. It was a smart move. I smirked faintly. I know. A shadow of a smile appeared on his lips. There is no longer tension between us. There is no war left to fight, just this simple, undeniable truth. He tried to push me aside, and I had proven him incorrect. He lifted his glass. To Parker and Company, he stated this time. As I clinked my glass with his, I did not feel angry. I didn't feel resentful. Only tranquility because I'd already won, and I no longer needed his permission to know it. As I sit in my office now, overlooking the city where I built my empire, I reflect on the lessons this trip has taught me. That family might be your greatest adversary. Loyalty is a currency, not a promise. That power is never given. It's taken, but more importantly, sometimes the finest method to prove your worth is to quit seeking validation and create something so powerful that they can never ignore you again. I don't have any regrets. Parker and Company are now mine, and I aim to make sure that no one forgets it. Thank you for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so and hit the notification bell to stay updated with more shocking real-life stories happening around you.